August is finally over, and it legitimately felt like one of the longest months of the entire year so far. I read 7 books in August, all from different genres. There was literary fiction, magical realism, romance, mystery, thriller, sci-fi, and I'm sure that there's some that I was forgetting, but it was a very wide spectrum of genres that I read this month, and now it's time to talk about the books. So let's get into it. The first book that I read in August was Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. This was published in 2023, and I had obviously seen a lot about it because it was part of Reese's book club, which the algorithm always suggests to me, and I also just see it in bookstores, and it's got the badge on it and everything. I also had a couple friends that read this book and said that I would really like it, and I just was never in the mood to read something like this for a long time, but I finally picked it up. This feels like a really good summer read that is not in the romance category. I think when we think of summer reads, oftentimes it's the easy, it's the quick, it's the romance. This is not really easy, quick, or romance, but it does feel like a relaxing, sweet, heartwarming read, and the book takes place in the summer, so the vibes were just there. This book follows Laura in 2020 on a cherry farm in Michigan as she tells the story of her childhood and her early life to her 3 daughters. So we have 2 tenses going on. One is the present tense where she is currently telling the story to her kids, and the other is the past tense where we see the story that she's telling play out. The really interesting thing about it though is that it feels like we as the reader are being told a story about somebody telling a story, if that makes sense. It feels like I am actually one of the children sitting in a room while somebody is telling me a story about their life. So it's kind of like a weird story inception, which again, I didn't realize until about halfway through, but I really liked it and it kind of fit the vibe of the book. It feels like you're sitting down and really gleaning wisdom from somebody and hearing their life story, and I really, really enjoyed that aspect of it. Laura kind of falls into being an actress and a theater actress. It follows her time with a fictional theater company, and it kind of follows her relationships and her romances in the early part of her career and her life and how it morphed into her settling down, living on a farm, and having 3 kids with her husband. This book was so sweet, and I loved the writing. The prose were beautiful. The sentence structure was beautiful. I adored the characters. I felt so emotionally attached and connected to them. This was really, really, really close to being a 5-star for me. However, my personal opinion is that a lot of times in the literary fiction category or the contemporary fiction category, in order for a book to be taken seriously or to be considered hard-hitting and emotional, it needs to be tragic or sad, and that is not always my favorite thing to read. I think the books that just are perpetually happy and simple throughout the entire storyline often feel like they are not as important and not as good as other books that, again, are just kind of sad and tragic. This book was positive, maybe not happy, but positive the whole time through, and you're really rooting for this character and you want her to find happiness in the end. And I literally got to the last 20 pages and I was like, oh my gosh, this feels like an emotional, raw, a really important book that doesn't kind of fall into that trap of tragedy in order for people to take it seriously. And then in the 11th hour, there was just enough of it that was thrown in there that kind of made me disappointed. Like, it couldn't stand on its own 2 feet as the story that it was becoming and the happy ending that it was becoming, and the author felt like she had to throw something in there to really hit the reader right in the heart. I think that just ends up being a personal preference thing. Sometimes I do love that. Sometimes I really want to read a sad book and feel all of those emotions, but I just have a problem with people thinking that a happy book does not reach the same level as those other books. I thought this was going to be the one, and maybe it is because it is primarily, I think, a very positive and easygoing book, but the ending just threw a little bit of that in there that kind of made me knock it down a couple points, so it wasn't quite a 5-star, but I did end up giving this a 4.5 stars, and it was really great, and I loved it, and I would highly recommend it, especially if you live in Michigan or have vacationed in Michigan or are interested in that at all, because the author really paints such a beautiful picture of the mitten in the summer, and I obviously love that. So, Tom Lake. The next book that I read was House of Glass by Sarah Pekkanen. So if you have been watching my videos for a little bit, you'll know that I am really on the hunt for a good mystery thriller book that doesn't make me upset. I've read The Silent Patient recently and I loved that book, and that kind of is my standard right now for like a psychological mystery, don't really know what's going on, but then has this like crazy ending at the end. And everything that I have kind of read in that genre or around that genre, I've been pretty disappointed in, just the ending wise. I always get hooked in the beginning and then the ending is just so unsatisfying to me. And unfortunately, this does kind of fall into that same category. So this book follows Stella, who is a best interest attorney for minors, which basically means that she is assigned to court cases like divorces or social work cases or foster cases, where she works with a child and works with a family and then gives a recommendation to the judge residing over the case of where the child should go or what should happen to them. It's most common in divorce cases with young children where they're in a full custody battle. So the best interest lawyer will step in, observe the family, spend time with the family, and then make a recommendation of who the child should end up living with. So that is her job, which sounds like one of the craziest jobs of all time. And she is assigned a case, and they have a 9-year-old daughter named Rose who has stopped talking. She's fully mute because she recently witnessed the tragic, surprising death / potentially murder of her nanny. And now her parents are in a crazy, toxic, intense divorce case, and they both want full custody of Rose. Our main character, Stella, is very uniquely equipped to handle a case like this because she also witnessed a traumatic event in her childhood that caused her to be mute for a while. The judge that is actually residing over this case knows Stella and has worked with Stella and has kind of a history with her, and thinks that because of her childhood, she would be a really good best interest lawyer for Rose, the little girl who has stopped speaking. Stella starts spending time with this family in the Barclays, and they have this massive, beautiful country home that is like a little bit spooky and a little bit haunted, and there's no glass in the house at all because the mom is potentially afraid of glass. The nanny fell through a glass window on the upper floor, and that's how she ended up dying. And it just gets kind of spooky and it gets kind of weird, and Stella is getting threats made against her, and she's starting to think that the nanny's death, there's more to it than they had initially perceived. And I was there for that premise. All in, completely bought into the plot. I was on the edge of my seat the whole time. And then, as has been happening with these mystery thrillers that I've been reading, the ending is just not satisfying to me. It feels super rushed. It feels like all of the loose ends were phoned in and tied up in a way that just kind of didn't make sense, or it was too convenient. The twist wasn't really that twisty. It was like we only had 3 options for who the antagonist was going to end up being, and it ended up being one of those antagonists. But because we had been set up to believe that it was one of them this entire time, it wasn't really surprising. It was like, well, yeah, they were our only option in the end because that's what it was being set up for. I wanted to like it really badly. I'm really trying. I am going hard after the mystery thriller genre, and I feel like I'm striking out a lot. This one wasn't bad. Maybe I need to level my expectations more. It was fine. I ended up giving House of Glass a 3 out of 5 stars. Hopefully later down the road, we're gonna start picking up and finding some good ones here. I don't know. The next book that I read was Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Andy Weir is the same guy that wrote The Martian and Artemis. Project Hail Mary really just fits right into that niche that he is so good at writing, and it's super science-y and everything's in space. The characters are really funny and you're kind of laughing out loud the whole time, but the stakes are really high, but then they start talking about like physics and atoms and time relativity, and you're like, whoa, what is going on? I'm not entirely sure what's happening right now. I've been wanting to read this book for a while, but I just hadn't totally been in the mood for a sci-fi. That's also not a genre that I typically read, but I loved The Martian. It's honestly one of my favorite books. I also read his second book, Artemis, and I didn't really like Artemis that much. I liked the premise of it, but I personally don't think that Andy Weir is very good at writing female main characters. I had a little bit of issues with just how our main character was acting. It just didn't really feel super believable, and it kind of showed that this was a male writing a female writer. right now, but here we are back to true form. We have kind of like a Mark Watney type character from The Martian, and I don't personally have a problem with him repeating some of the same formulas that he did from The Martian because it works. It's funny. I know I'm gonna like it, and he just did such a great job. This book, compared to The Martian, the stakes are so much higher. In The Martian, we have one guy that is trying to save himself and get off Mars. In Project Hail Mary, we have one guy that is trying to save the literal world. At the start of the book, we find out that there is this microscopic alien life form, basically like little atoms, molecules in space, that is stealing the energy of our sun, which is bad because the Earth needs the sun. And if we continue to let this go on, we're basically going to go into another ice age, and people on the Earth are going to die, and crops are going to die, and it's going to be crazy and totally reset our ecosystem. So all of the scientific powers in the world, NASA, the Chinese government, the Russian government, they really band together to try to figure out a way to stop this. Our main character, Ryland Grace, is a like 3rd grade science teacher who at one point had written a paper completely out of the blue that was actually very dismissed at the time on a similar life form or a similar category as this alien life that is stealing the energy of our sun. So he gets kind of roped into this project to try and save the world. And he goes up into space, and he is alone in space in this tiny little spaceship. I think they say it's like 150 square feet of space for years. He's alone for years. And then the twist, I'm not going to say anything past that. Even though I think the twist happens pretty early in the book, I don't want to ruin it for anybody. It's just like really, really fun and sweet. And even though the stakes are so high for this, and you're like, the Earth is going to die fully. Every human on the Earth is going to be dead if he does not succeed. I'm just like laughing the whole time and having a grand old time, and it's funny, it's heartwarming, it's really, really interesting. I think he really stepped up the level of comprehension for all of the science stuff though. From what I remember of The Martian, yes, it was totally outside of my wheelhouse anytime he was talking about the botany and growing potatoes and all of the scientific processes that went into that. I didn't really understand it, but I felt like he explained it in a way where I still had a good comprehension of what was going on. There were a lot of things in Project Hail Mary where I was very lost. It went way over my head. We were talking about time, we were talking about relativity, we were talking about physics and everything that goes into that, and that was a lot harder for me to grasp than the concepts that were being introduced to us in The Martian. So that is one of the reasons why I didn't like it as much as The Martian. But that being said, even with all of the science stuff that went really far over my head, I didn't feel like the plot suffered at all. I still was fully bought into the plot, totally understood what was going on. I didn't feel like I was missing anything actually important, even though I knew that I was missing some of the science. I just really, really liked it, and I want everybody to read it. And I think they're making a movie with Ryan Gosling soon, which I'm here for. So, Project Hail Mary, 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was First Lie Wins. I got this from Book of the Month in August, even though it was a January Book of the Month pick. I ended up like adding it to my box last minute. And I know that I had read the premise in January initially. I thought that this was like another kind of mystery thriller type thing, and I wanted to go into it totally blind. So when I started it this month, I did not read the premise again. I just wanted to go straight into it. And it was not at all what I was expecting. I thought it was going to be kind of like a classic mystery thriller. You're kind of trying to figure out what's going on the whole time, a little bit spooky. I mean, the cover kind of feels a little bit spooky, so I thought that I knew what I was gonna get, and it ended up not being that. I don't even know if I would categorize this as a mystery at all. If anything, it was kind of like a espionage, maybe. Our main character is essentially a spy, but I don't know who she's a spy for, and she has different jobs and different targets that she goes after, like in politics or in the tech world, and she has to like get blackmail on them. Maybe she works for a private investigator, I don't know, but she basically is working on a mark in the beginning of this book, but the book evolves into her trying to separate herself from her boss, and I don't know who her boss is. And it's never explained. And I think I have a problem with that. I understand our character, I understand the outlying characters, but the person that she works for and why she's doing what she's doing never really made sense to me. I don't think the antagonist was fleshed out at all. It was just kind of like this big bad that was looming over us the entire time. But then she like defeats him and separates herself from him. But I get it's hard to talk about because I don't really think there was a lot of plot there. There was zero exposition, basically. It was just kind of talking about our main character and all of the jobs that she's completed in her lifetime. And I think the end was supposed to be like a really cool twist of, oh, she's been playing him the whole time. But it just didn't land that way for me. I did actually really like the writing style though. It was really interesting and unique. And I liked that. And I liked our main characters. I liked everybody. It was like the pieces were all there, but they just weren't falling into place. I just needed more motive for the antagonist, why he was doing what he was doing. And I didn't get any of that. And he wasn't scary enough for me to let that slide. There's sometimes in books where we have like the big bad, the big evil, the worst person of all time or the worst being of all time, and they don't need motives. They're just pure evil, and that's fine. But this is like a small town taking place in the South, little like crime operation, and I don't think that big bad formula works here. I need motive. I need exposition on him and his relationship with our main character, and I didn't get that. And so it felt very unresolved at the end. It felt like, oh, our main character got her happy ending and then does what she's gonna do at the end of it, but like, why? How did we end up here? Why are we here? I feel like a lot of things could have been avoided. I think there just needed to be more details and more fleshing out of that character and relationship. So it was good though. I think that I gave this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I am interested in reading more from Ashley Elston just because I really liked reading it and I liked how she wrote the book. So I think I am gonna look her up and try some of her other books as well. The next book that I read was The Love of My Afterlife by Kirsty Greenwood. What to say about this book? We're like 5 books into the month of August at this point, and I had only read literary fiction, mystery, thriller, and sci-fi, and my brain was feeling a little bit fried, and I knew I needed a palate cleanser. I just needed like a quick, easy, short romance to be able to dive into and dive out of. And so I picked this one because it was a new book of the month pick, and I didn't really like it that much. The premise is that Delphi, our main character, chokes on a hamburger helper's meal and dies. And she goes to heaven, sort of, and she meets her afterlife therapist who is supposed to be there to help the transition between death and the great beyond. And while she is meeting with her afterlife therapist, somebody else appears in this afterlife waiting room who has gone under anesthesia from a dentist appointment, and him and Delphi meet and they realize that they are soulmates. But the guy is not dead. He's just under The guy is not dead. He's just under anesthesia. And the afterlife therapist is like, oh yeah, that happens sometimes. Basically, Delphi and the therapist strike up a bargain that if the therapist sends Delphi back to Earth, she has 10 days to find the guy that she met in the waiting room and get him to kiss her, and then she can continue to live out her life on Earth. I like that premise. I actually think it's really interesting and very compelling, and that's why I picked up the book initially, is because I was interested in that storyline. But the whole thing really turned into a multiverse version of the movie All About Steve with Sandra Bullock. If anybody's ever seen that, Sandra Bullock plays somebody that goes on a blind date with this guy named Steve, who's like a news cameraman who travels all around the country, and then instantly, literally instantly, Sandra Bullock's like, I'm in love with him. I need to go find him and follow him around the world. And she just obsessively chases this guy for an entire movie. And it's weird and it feels very stalkerish, and she feels unhinged and very strange. And this book had a lot of those vibes. Our main character, in my opinion, was not very likable. She was very obsessive over this man that she had literally spent 5 minutes with in an afterlife therapy room, and she's chasing him across, I think this takes place in London. She's chasing him across the entire city of London, trying to get him to kiss her. And she runs into him a couple times and she acts like an absolute fool. And he is legitimately scared of her because of the way that she is acting. But to us, it's supposed to be like kind of romantic, and it's supposed to be, oh my gosh, like she's going after her true love. That's great. Good for her. I really want them to get together. But the whole time she's doing this, she has a partner that's going with her, which is like her cranky neighbor. And of course, she starts to fall in love with her cranky neighbor and not the guy that is supposedly her soulmate that she's actually running after. It was very odd. I didn't like the writing style. Every single character was, the only word that comes to mind and the only way that I can best describe it is quirky. Every character was quirky in a way that was almost like tokenism. Like, this is the token quirky character and they're weird and they do weird things. But that was every single character, which was very fatiguing, and nobody was likable, and it was just kind of obnoxious all around. I also have some issues that I actually was a little bit offended by. Our main character, Delphi, her weight is talked about a lot in this book in a very odd way, in a way that I think is supposed to be body positive, but the way that it was actually coming across was kind of derogative and really weird. For example, there's a scene where she goes to her friend to try to get this like ball gown for a gala that she's going to try to chase after and stalk this guy that she's supposed to kiss. She goes to her friend and her mom is there and she's like, hey, do you have anything for me to wear? And the mom is like, oh, you have a dress that you wore a couple years ago when you were 10 pounds heavier. It would probably fit Delphi now. And I'm like, why was that necessary to put in? I don't understand why it was even necessary to comment on either of their weights at all. Another example that felt weird was they're at this gala and she keeps making references to the Spanx that she's wearing, the compression shorts that she's wearing in order to fit into the dress. And at one point, the guy that she's with, her neighbor, not the guy that she's trying to get to kiss her, cuts his palm open on like a piece of glass. And so she kneels down and rips her shorts and wraps it around his hand. And it's described that she's kneeling on the ground and she has a slit in her dress so you can see her thighs and you can see the compression shorts that she's wearing. And it's like there's a scene where the guy is looking at her legs. And I think it's supposed to be in a way where he thinks she's really sexy, so he's looking down at her legs. But the thing that comes out of the main character's mouth and the way that the author chose to portray that scene was something like, I looked down and I saw that I had 2 muffin tops on my thighs. And then I look back at this guy and I'm like, hey, some people have a little extra meat on their thighs, okay? And I just don't understand. I don't know why any of that was necessary to comment on. It just felt like she kept throwing things in about this main character's weight and her dress size and her thighs and the way that she felt in her body, and it was all negative. And I think that it was in there in order to be a body positive book, but it wasn't positive at all. And so I really didn't like that. It felt super, super weird and super negative. And I just don't think what I hope she was trying to accomplish was accomplished well at all. So for those reasons, bad characters, obnoxious plot, good premise, but weird writing, I'm giving this book a 2.5. The next book that I read was One Italian Summer by Rebecca Searle. I have actually read one other Rebecca Searle book in my life, and I didn't realize that until I was about halfway into it. The book that I read previously written by her is The Dinner List, and I looked up on my Goodreads profile, and I read that like 7 years ago. And I had rated it a 4 out of 5 stars. I don't remember a lot about it, so I don't know what I would really rate it now, but I remember that that book was about a woman who is turning 30, and on her 30th birthday, she goes to her dinner party that her best friend is throwing. It's kind of playing off the concept of if you could have dinner with 5 people of your choice, living or dead, who would it be? So she goes to this dinner party and Audrey Hepburn's there, and her father who had died is there, and an ex-boyfriend who she hasn't spoken to in a long time is there, and it's these people that you could never actually have dinner with, and there's kind of like an element of magical realism to it. And I thought that that was a really interesting concept. I obviously didn't give it a 5-star, and I don't really remember why, but once I realized that I had read this author before, I was even more excited to jump into One Italian Summer. So I picked this book up partly because I like the cover a lot. Also because the plot and the premise sounded really sweet. It follows our main character, Katie, whose mom literally just dies from cancer at the very beginning of the book. And Katie kind of talks about her mom as being the great love of her life. She loves her mom. Her mom loved her. They were absolute best friends, closer than you could possibly imagine. And now her mom is dead, and Katie is reeling from this, and she's grieving, and it's really hard for her to imagine life without her mom. She is struggling in her marriage with her husband now. She's struggling in her relationship with her dad now. She's struggling with her friendships just because she doesn't really know how to continue on without her mom. Before her mom's death, they had planned a trip to Italy together to go back to Positano, which was the same place that her mom had spent a couple weeks when she was also the same age as Katie. And so they had been planning this mother-daughter trip for a really long time. And her mom dies 2 weeks before they were supposed to take the trip. Katie is having an existential crisis right now and decides to go on the trip alone and just kind of like grieve in her own time. So while she's on this trip, at the beginning of the trip, she sees her mother there in Italy with her. However, it is not her mother as she most recently knew her, but her mother from 30 years ago when she was on her solo trip to Italy. She's the same age as Katie now. She obviously doesn't know who Katie is, so Katie gets to essentially spend this trip in Italy still going on it with her mom like she planned, but it's her mom from back in time. At that point, I was all in for this book. I loved the setup, I loved the focus on a mother-daughter relationship, and I loved the setting. The way that she writes about Italy is so wonderful and beautiful, and I loved it so much. However, once we really start getting to the meat of the plot, it kind of falls off for me, unfortunately. Our main character, Katie, doesn't really go through a lot of growth and change. She kind of just makes really bad choices and bad decisions. She treats her husband, who is back home waiting for her, horribly. Awful. She is a terrible person in Italy, but we're supposed to believe it's her kind of eat, pray, love experience. It's her grieving experience, but she's actually just hurting more people along the way, and it's kind of romanticized throughout the entire book, but I just felt really uncomfortable with it and the way that things are being portrayed. And then in the end, after all of these decisions that she's made, there is a plot mechanic that happens that kind of erases everything and gives her a clean slate. She doesn't have to face any of the conflict, and she doesn't have to face any of the decisions that she was making while she was abroad. And I just, I didn't really like that. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel like this character actually grieved her mom. It didn't feel like it was written well in a story arc that made sense for character growth and character development, especially in the relationships that she was keeping back home with her dad and her husband. It just kind of felt like Katie goes to Italy, is sad, but ends up partying with her mom and doing all this crap over here. And then at the end, she's like, well, now I can go back to my normal life, and things just carry on as normal. And I don't think that it was landing the way that the author intended it to land. And so I was actually pretty disappointed in this one because, like I said, the setup, the setting, the premise of a mother-daughter relationship and kind of diving into those intricacies, I was really, really excited about. The way that it ended, the way that our character ended up just wasn't really my cup of tea. I also think that the author hid behind a lot of flowery language and romantic prose and sentence structure. The way that she wrote, you could read a single line and be like, wow, that is really beautiful. And then all of a sudden it's kind of manipulating your view of the book and the story itself. And I realized that halfway through, I was like, oh, I really want to underline some of this stuff. I want to remember this quote. This is so beautifully said. And it was affecting how I viewed the book as a whole. And I kind of had to snap out of that halfway through, that this beautiful writing does not actually make a beautiful story. So I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. I really thought it was going to be higher in the beginning, but unfortunately it just didn't reach there, and it just kept kind of getting worse as the book went on. So 1 Italian Summer, 3 out of 5 stars. And then the last book that I read to wrap up August is called How to Read a Book by Monica Wood. This is one that I kind of picked up on a whim at a bookstore recently. I always love books that are about books and bookshops or libraries and about people who love books. I feel like it's kind of an inside joke between the author and the reader. It's like, you are somebody that really likes books reading a book about somebody that really likes books. I've just always gravitated towards those kinds of stories, and that is the reason why I picked up this book. And then I read the premise on the inside jacket and was definitely interested. So we are following 3 characters here: Violet, Harriet, and Frank. Violet is 22, who went to jail for drunk driving and accidental manslaughter. She caused the death of this woman named Lauren Daigle when she was 19 years old. She goes to prison for 28 months, but she gets off on good behavior 6 months early, and she's basically dropped off by her sister in Portland, Maine as like a, see ya, get your life together, we want nothing to do with you anymore. You've ruined everything. Harriet is a retired school teacher. She's in her early 60s, who runs a book club at the prison that Violet was incarcerated at. So Violet was actually in Harriet's book club, and this book club really helps all of the women in this prison feel creative. It's helping towards their rehabilitation. It's helping towards, the correctional part of the correctional facility. And so she really does a lot of good and is just a very sweet character. Frank is the husband of Lorraine Daigle, who was the one that died because of Violet's driving under the influence. All of these 3 characters meet at a bookshop in Portland, Maine, kind of serendipitously. When I read the premise of this book, I was super, super excited because you could just tell that all 3 of these characters are going to be forced together and forced to interact with each other and kind of create these relationships, but they have a lot to get through to create these relationships. Like Harriet and Frank kind of have an interesting little flirtation, cute romance thing going on. Harriet and Violet really kind of stick together. Harriet becomes sort of a mother figure to Violet, and Harriet is there to support her as she starts to get her life together. Frank and Violet have to work through the fact that she killed his wife accidentally. So I was excited for deep, meaningful character studies of getting through conflict, themes of forgiveness and guilt and shame, and I didn't really get any of that, actually. It kind of just felt like they all came together, they had a semi-difficult conversation, but not really, and then they're just like instant best friends, and then you just follow them for the rest of the book as Frank and Harriet fall in love, and Violet like gets a job at a university lab working with parrots and a Russian doctor. It was very odd. I just feel like the setup was there for something really emotional and hard-hitting and interesting and like a good commentary on forgiveness and the mistakes that we make in life and people making a new life. And it just kind of felt like the author dropped the ball a little bit, if I'm going to be honest. It was like you had so much meat there and you just went for something that was very surface level and sweet and enjoyable. I did really enjoy it, but I just wanted so much more from it. I thought I was going to get so much more from it, and I didn't. And so that was a little bit disappointing, but it was a good read. It was a fun read. There were some funny parts. There were some very interesting plot mechanics that happened. And there were some things with Violet that I thought were interesting. Like, I think that the author describes her coming out of prison and learning to rebuild her life and the difficulties of getting a job, the difficulties of even like opening up a bank account. I think that that was an interesting thing to kind of shed light on. Weirdly enough, it didn't seem like Violet struggled at all. It just kind of felt like she would run into Good Samaritan after Good Samaritan after Good Samaritan, and they would take pity on her and they would give her a library card without actually proving that she has a permanent residence. They would open up a bank account for her, but she doesn't have a license. And it's because she just shares her story, and then the good people of Portland, Maine are like, oh, we pity you, I'm gonna help you. So Violet didn't really grow through difficult challenges. Obviously, she was in prison and that was really difficult for her. But even Violet in the book is like, I had it really easy in prison compared to some people. It was hard for me to have compassion for her because things just kept working out. And maybe that was just the type of book that the author wanted to write, was something a little bit more simple and a little bit easier to read, but she picked such tough subject matter that I was expecting a lot more. It was still really nice and I did like it, but I'm giving this one a 3.75 out of 5 stars. So there you have it. The books of August. There were some good ones, there were some that were a lot more disappointing, and then there were some that were just plain obnoxious to me. I didn't read any fantasy this month. I know I talk about this all the time, but fantasy is typically my favorite genre that I go for, and I feel like in September, I'm gonna go full steam ahead in fantasy and see what we can do there. I'm ready for fall. I'm ready for some cozy, spooky fall reads, and I might do a video that's talking about that in a little bit. But once again, thank you for joining. Thank you for watching. If you end up picking up any of these books, let me know what you think about them. If you've already read some of them, I would love to know your thoughts in the comments as well, and we'll see you next time.